It's frankly scary how few people these days actually understand ethics. Granted, it's not as though we live in a world where people are going around and just killing each other. I mean, I guess we technically do, but what I mean to say is that it's not as though most of us don't understand the difference between right and wrong. Even these so-called moral relativists, subjectivists, and nihilists will talk about their beliefs but never really stand behind them in a meaningful way. The people who talk about morality being subjective are the same ones who endlessly go on about the moral evils of racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry perpetuated by allegedly oppressive, i.e. immoral, institutions. And so, as I've often discussed, this seems to come down to not knowing what the word subjective means when they make the claim that morality is subjective. But just as often, like I said, it also comes down to not understanding morality. Not as a concept, because as we acknowledged at the beginning, everybody knows the different moral values that our actions can have. We are instead simply met with a strange cultural movement that aims to change the definition of morality altogether. In this, we arrive at a misconception that there is only one category into which all moral values fall. Everything is either good or it is bad, and the field of ethics doesn't concern itself with literally anything else. This misconception is, of course, false. In the course of this video, I will show you that we can confidently say that there are at least 3 ethical categories, if not more. And I think knowing these categories will help you to have a better understanding of ethics, and in fact, if everyone understood this, a lot of divisive issues would cease to be so controversial. Because devoid of this deeper understanding, it really shouldn't be a surprise that so many people struggle to accept morality as the objective truth that it is. There's this disconnect between the truth that we intuitively know and the way in which these people conceptualize morality. And I think this disconnect can answer the question of why there are a lot of strange replies from moral subjectivists online. When confronted with the fact that in order to have applicable beliefs, like the belief in oppression, they actually do have to accept the existence of objective morality, they will act as though they are arguing from some non-ethical form of social conduct. This is why moral subjectivists usually argue in terms of rights, when obviously the issue here is that right-based ethics, as the name implies, is an ethical framework. It all comes down to not understanding that rights and other complex values of conduct are ethical in nature. From the Oxford Dictionary, yes, morality is the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior, and the extent to which an action is right or wrong, but it is also a particular system of values and principles of conduct. Likewise, from Merriam-Webster, morality is particular moral principles or rules of conduct. As it is defined here, it is just about conduct. We could get hung up on definitions if, for whatever reason, you can't accept that morality and ethics as a whole can simply refer to any action that is prescriptive in nature, an action where something should, or in a socially binding sense, can happen. But words are just sounds and symbols. They don't really mean anything by themselves. It's the concepts that our words represent. That's what we're really communicating in, or at least we're trying to. So controversially, what I just said right there doesn't necessarily exclude pluralism, the idea that there can be several conflicting truths that are all of equal value. Or at least I suppose I should be more specific and say that it doesn't exclude it in the sense that there can be different interpretations of one singular truth rather than separate truths. You can conceptualize morality differently. You can use different names for the categories I'm about to present to you, but regardless of how they exist, they do exist, and that is my claim. And honestly, all of that, I think, is yet another thing that trips up moral subjectivists. They ask these somewhat absurd questions, like how can there be an objective truth if everyone disagrees? Well, for one, obviously a lot of people could be wrong. Just like how if you say morality is subjective, you are disagreeing with dozens, if not hundreds of philosophers from antiquity to now who say that it is objective. But secondly, the premise is just false. Most people do agree. You don't really have any logically consistent ethical framework that advocates for random killings. For the most part, arguments about a lot of deeper philosophical concepts, in this case ethics, are just about conceptualization. Now, obviously, there are a lot of exceptions to that. There are some more concrete disagreements, but obviously for the purposes of this video, any argument of different ethical categories is just clearly conceptual and not concrete. To explain what I mean, if you took Kantian ethics, it would be clear right away that there are at least 2 distinct ethical categories: perfect duties and imperfect ones. The former is constructed by saying, if everyone violated this rule, would that cause a contradiction? Essentially, would society cease to be or cease to function in a meaningful way? If you take murder, yes, if everyone committed murder, then everyone would kill everyone else and there would be nobody left. Well, presumably, there would be at least one guy left. Point is, murder leads to contradiction. Now, compare that to an imperfect duty. This can be more or less constructed by asking, will society get worse, but not necessarily cease to exist if everyone failed to uphold this rule? This can be something like giving to charity, where the act benefits society. I'm obviously just skimming through this for the sake of time, but here we've noticed an interesting distinction. There are moral values which one should be forced to uphold, or at the very least, one is logically compelled to uphold. And then there are actions which are not necessarily compelled, but are good. Here we have that there are things you should do, and then things that you more broadly and more restrictively cannot do. And this isn't just something we get from Kantian ethics. If we started with something like moral egoism, for example, and built it up through a very consequentialist framework where we are always trying to net the best outcome for ourselves, it would be the same. In fact, this goes towards proving that there is an objective moral truth, and as I said earlier, it's only really our conceptualizations that differ, because moral egoism is going to start looking more and more like deontology. That is, a system of ethics that focuses on moral obligation after only a few questions. For example, if we want the best outcome for ourselves, are we going to get that from screwing people over? Are people going to want to help us if we do that? And if everyone acts like this, then isn't this counterproductive to our goal? In a world where everyone is trying to cheat each other, fighting tooth and nail for what they want, suddenly it becomes a lot harder to get what you want. This is something on which game theorists recently have done a lot of study, regarding the evolution of collaboration and ethics. Prisoner's Dilemma, a study by Robert Axelrod, I believe, if you want to look it up, since again, I don't want to bog this video down trying to explain ethical frameworks or argue for which one I think is the most correct. I just want to highlight that yes, there are these concrete differences in frameworks, but they're likely not as big as you would imagine, and we often end up at the same conclusion, just parsed a bit differently. Here, logically, same as with Kantian ethics, we would derive that there are actions we would like others to do for us, and so we should do for others, but we are by no means compelled to do it because it isn't certain that they will reciprocate, which is the reason we perform these actions. And then there are actions that we cannot do because they would be counterproductive to our own self-interest. They would create this world where it is harder, if not impossible, for us to get what we want. From this vastly different framework, we arrived at the first two categories just the same. The categories being that which is permissible and that which is good. There is a tendency among internet pundits of right-based ethics to claim that the concept of something being permissible is somehow not an ethical value. But I can only imagine that is because right-based ethics tends to conceptualize things in slightly more different categories of negative and positive rights. These concepts just label whether something is prohibited by a government or society, negative rights, or if it is provided by the same entity, positive rights. Most libertarians, for example, don't really believe in positive rights. The idea instead is that the government cannot tell you what to do, they can only tell you what not to do to others. This, again, being negative rights. The government prohibiting murder is a person's negative right to life, whereas a positive right to life would be if the government had to ensure that you lived, typically through healthcare and other social programs, rather than just prohibiting others to take your life. I think the issue here with the distinction that followers of right-based ethics tend to draw is that there's a great deal of similarity between the concept of negative rights and positive rights and Kantian ethics. It's just a matter of conceptualization. For example, murder. The obligation of person A to not kill person B under Kantian ethics is a lot like person A's protection from being killed by person B under negative rights, especially when we consider that person B is penalized under negative rights. So the concept of permissibility cannot be excluded from ethics as if it's something else. Because again, when I say ethics, I just mean this second definition, prescriptive conduct. While sometimes that which is permissible can be good, obviously it doesn't mean that anything that is allowed must be good. I am just saying that what is allowed is a prescriptive claim of what can or cannot be done. Something that is allowed doesn't need to be good in order to say that it is ethical. Because also, quite strangely, not all things that are good fall into the next and final ethical category, which just so happens to be the most complex of all of the categories. So complex, actually, that I don't know if I've ever seen this concept acknowledged anywhere outside of maybe virtue ethics of antiquity. Which, to some extent, makes sense, because I first discovered this concept for myself when I considered the possible existence of self-virtue in egoism. You see, if we go back to the example of moral egoism, if the pursuit of morality is self-gain, actions involving the self, which don't necessarily involve others or society, at least not directly, are still moral. And by that I mean prescriptive in nature. I know this one, most of all, probably causes the greatest amount of controversy because, again, we have been instilled with this strange preconceived notion that morality must necessarily involve other people. but it doesn't. Remember, it's just a code of conduct. And I mean, after all, we may think that this is something that defies the definition as we know it, but virtually all of us operate under the notion that things can be bad for us. Smoking is bad, drinking is bad, drug use is another example. Which of course, then with something like that, you could point to the indirect effects it has on society and claim that this instead is why we hold it to be immoral. But without considering the self in addition to others in society as a whole, something like bestiality could never be considered immoral. Don't know why I picked that one out of all possible examples. I feel like you guys are looking at me weird, but you could argue the possibility of disease transmission, but that just kind of gives a hand-waving explanation. If for any of those other examples, including smoking, drinking, or drug use, we simply say that it could lead to health complications, we are then presupposing self-gain. We are assuming that disease is undesirable, that death is undesirable, and the pursuit of what was desirable for the self was the mechanism by which we decided what was moral under an egoist perspective. So it is necessarily true that these actions not involving others have moral values. And you can say, okay, but that's just moral egoism. Unless I can prove moral egoism, then there's room for doubt. However, like the other two moral categories, goodness and permissibility, I think all we need to do is ask ourselves, is there a necessary niche into which a category could logically fall under any and all possible frameworks? And perhaps you've noticed it, there does seem to be a trend where we can logically anticipate a third category. Whether or not an action is permissible is a question of how society acts as a whole. In Kantian ethics, it is if our action disrupts society. The same clearly could logically be said of any non-egoist framework and was even true of egoism, just as a matter of self-interest universalized. Whether or not an action is good is a question of others. It can be a question of society, but only in ways that do not conflict with the self. And by that, I simply mean that the destruction of society or the destruction of our moral goal both involve us directly, which both decide if an action is permissible. That which is good is a less restrictive category of other. So finally, that must necessarily leave the least restrictive category, the self. In egoist frameworks, it's likely that the self only considers, well, the self, and that's why it's called egoism. So this third category is conceptualized in egoist frameworks as being self-interest devoid of outside factors, at least to some extent. In egoism, just as we had to consider the ways we treated others, not just because of the direct consequence it could have on us, but because of the indirect consequence it could have on us as universalized through society, maybe here even egoism would consider the way in which others in society at large would perceive our own actions towards the self. And as such, these actions towards ourselves must be limited. In layman's terms, social norms and a few other things that we'll get to that involve things you do to yourself or for yourself that don't have an immediate effect on society but can be judged or not judged by society. Obviously, beyond egoism, the same would follow in other frameworks that place others or society as a whole above the self, meaning we always end at the same concept, the normative self. Sometimes, pursuant to whatever goal, one party in a moral statement may act or may be compelled to act or not act in another in affirming the morality of an action. Yeah, sorry, I literally could not think of a way to generalize that in a sentence that was easier to understand, so let me just give an example. You should follow along quickly. Suicide, bad. Hot take, right? But if we look at why it is bad, especially under weaker ethical frameworks where we just say that life is inherently valuable and we give no further explanation as to what that means, we can see that suicide is ethically the same as murder, which is weird. Yes, both involve the taking of a life, but we don't really perceive it as being the same, and we definitely don't treat it as though it is the same. Even under something like Kantian ethics, or at least as I summarize Kantian ethics, suicide would be a violation of a perfect duty, just the same as murder. If you murder everyone, society ceases to exist. If everyone ends their own lives, society, just the same, ceases to exist. If you only consider the good of others and the good of society as a whole, you cannot have a holistic ethical framework. You have to consider the obligations that people must uphold in actions targeted at the self. Otherwise, there is no distinction between suicide and murder, which there must necessarily be. You wouldn't kill a dude trying to end his own life as if you've saved him from his murderer. Sorry, I don't know why I found that one so funny. But anyways, it's not as though it's something you can defend against, as if you're protecting someone from an aggressor when that person is the aggressor. Nor is it something you can punish proportionally. I mean, well, obviously, because the person would be dead, so it's not as though you could punish him. But theoretically, what sense would there be in punishing death by death? And if the taking of a life is a violation of some rule, either a Kantian duty or some divine command on the value of human life, in either case, where are we justified in defending ourselves? Is the man who takes his own life his own murderer? Or is he his own defender for killing the man who aimed to kill him? The belief that all actions whose target is the self can be treated the same as an action when the target is someone else will always lead to contradictions. It's then then that we find this entirely separate category of moral actions, one that I can't even really give a name to, because as far as I'm aware, it has no name. I can only describe it in terms of the concepts it encompasses, which, as I've said and alluded to, is the normative self and the affirmation of moral values. This category is where we get expressions like, "but I get it," and "do you want a cookie?" Because you can have an action that is illegal, immoral, but then we all look to each other and say, "but I get it." And then the complete opposite, you can have something that is legal and good, but it is morally expected of us. Which is to say that it's not something like donating to charity that is praiseworthy. No, these are actions that are not compelled, but you are still expected to do them because they are good. So just to give it a name in order to wrap the video up nicely, we have the permissibility of an action, the goodness of an action, and finally the reception of an action. If you can just even vaguely familiarize yourself with these concepts, then you will know more about ethics than the average person. For example, yes, sometimes governments and groups of people set arbitrary laws, but if we understand permissibility as a sort of more restrictive form of right and wrong, you'll be able to avoid the confusion and headaches that could happen otherwise. Like from a staunch consequentialist framework, for example, you might say that it would be moral to have a Punisher-like approach of killing any serious criminal because the outcome is a safer society. But if just anyone and everyone did that, then how safe would society be? You'd be putting the fate of society at large not in the hands of an impartial system, but in the hands of the average man with a frighteningly average intelligence. And that is even without considering how dangerous the world would be if people could thinly veil the murder of innocent people by falsely claiming they were criminals. Here in this example, you could stammer your way through doublespeak like, "oh, you should do it, but you shouldn't do it," or how it's good in theory but not in practice, which is a fairly common phrase that often fails to be anything more than just that, a phrase, and one that's almost never true. We didn't practice this. It didn't fail in practice. It did fail in theory. It failed to be permissible as a moral good, but it is still theoretically good. It's not should and shouldn't or theory and practice. You need these terms to communicate the idea. It is an impermissible good. At least it would be under this consequentialist framework. It is an instance where the law ought to be more restrictive than what would otherwise be interpersonally good. And the other side of this is actions that one would expect to be prohibited by law because they are immoral, but are allowed because the prohibition leads to some larger contradiction. And if you have any questions about that one, see all of libertarianism, because those guys like to think that that describes basically every immoral action. All in all, knowing these categories can not only help you in communication, but, shocker, it can help you become a more moral and balanced person. Because just like I said at the beginning of this video, the fact that a lot of people don't understand this, especially like, for example, the last ethical category, causes a lot of unnecessary and heated arguments. Society can't seem to make up its mind if mental illness is good or bad. We can't seem to agree if disability should be perceived as these horrible things or superpowers. And we seem to have one side of the aisle that praises all social norms as if these norms can never be harmful, and another side that wants to deconstruct every norm as if no norm can be helpful. And it's because we don't really recognize that norms, at least in part, exist as their own ethical category. We either allow them to be subsumed by interpersonal ethics, which leads to an obvious disconnect, or because of that, we deny their moral value altogether. This may be a bit controversial, but for example, as I've grown older, I've come to second guess my views on homosexuality. And it isn't because I've suddenly decided that gay people are hurting anyone. They aren't. Aside from divine command theory, there isn't really much of an argument you can make as to why it is immoral, which, side note, doesn't really mean much because you can say that anything is immoral under divine command theory. But at the same time, would it be desirable from an egoist perspective to live a life where your dating pool is slimmer? A life where you will always feel cast aside and othered because your sexuality doesn't adhere to what will always be the biological norm? And from a perspective that focuses on the well-being of others, would we want others to go through this? The answer seems to be no, but at the same time, do you shame this person? A person that may not even be psychologically capable of changing sexualities. Aren't we then doing far worse? If we're trying to protect this person from distress, then we run into a contradiction where we cause distress by trying to affirm these social norms. This is what I mean by disconnect. Whether it's sexuality, gender identity, other social norms like the relationship between men and women, society's perception of mental illness, or anything else like that, it is okay to accept that something can be, for lack of a better word, less than ideal without it necessarily being immoral in an interpersonal sense. I think even if you find yourself on a very fundamentalist side of one or any of these issues, like being a divine command theorist where you think that some of these things are immoral, I think it's hard to ignore that society will always find itself divided, either praising things that should be condemned or praising things that should neither be praised nor condemned. And I think you need to accept that society will continue to do so until we can find a way to bridge the gap in this disconnect between our words and the truth, until we can find a deeper understanding of ethics. He said the thing. He said the name of the title in the video. He did the thing.